Over the past few years, Canada's collision repair industry has been hit by a growing number of catastrophic weather events. Hailstorms, floods, and wildfires are generating record insurance losses and creating sudden spikes in repair demand. At the same time, today's vehicles are more complex than ever, making the decision to repair or declare a total loss increasingly difficult. Few companies have a better view of those trends than IAA. As one of the world's largest digital marketplaces for total loss and damaged vehicles, IAA sits at the intersection of insurers, salvage, and the collision repair industry. Every major catastrophe provides valuable insight into how claims are handled, how vehicles move through the system, and what that means for repairers. Today, we'll be discussing what IAA is seeing across Canada, how catastrophic events are changing the auto claims economy, and most importantly, what collision repair businesses can do to prepare for the future. Dr. Phil, if you'd like to take it away and tell us what's changed since the last time we spoke.
Yeah, well, thanks so much. I'm Phil Klotzbach. I'm in the Department of Atmospheric Science at Colorado State University in the United States. And our group at Colorado State does a lot of different things, but one of the big things that we do each and every year is we release seasonal Atlantic hurricane predictions. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about the current hurricane season. And then we will discuss some of these other perils as well that can cause very significant damage up in Canada. So, maybe some of you have heard about the Super El Nino that's coming, a very, very powerful El Nino. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, just came out with their latest updated El Nino forecast a couple of hours ago. And they are calling for about a 70% chance of the strongest El Nino on record. It would exceed 2.5 degrees Celsius in the tropical Pacific, which is an extremely high value for that area. And I have personally been trying to push even more than a super El Nino as what I like to call a Jurassic El Nino, because it's going to be so warm. But, when it comes to Atlantic hurricanes, that is good news because El Nino tends to reduce Atlantic hurricane activity. And I'll talk a little more about how it does so here in just a minute. So, us at Colorado State, we issue forecasts 4 times a year. Our first forecast is in early April. We update it in early June, early July, and early August. And while August is 2 months into the hurricane season, the Atlantic hurricane season is extremely peaked. You get about 90% of your hurricane activity during August, September, and October. So our latest forecast is for a total of 9 named storms. And what the heck's a named storm? A named storm is any system named by the National Hurricane Center. So it includes all tropical storms and hurricanes. So anything that gets a name is what we call a named storm. So these are winds of 39 miles per hour or greater. Of those 9, 4 becoming hurricanes, and of those 4, 1 becoming a major Category 3, 4, 5 hurricane on the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale. Those are hurricanes with winds of 111 miles per hour or greater. We've already had 3 weak storms this year. Arthur, Bertha, and Cristobal. If you were, took a day off from work, you probably never heard of these storms because they were here today, gone tomorrow kind of storms. One thing I do want to point out is that we also forecast a couple of integrated metrics, such as accumulated cyclone energy. And that's kind of a geeky metric. It accounts for storm intensity and duration. So long-lived, powerful hurricanes generate a lot of ACE. Weak, short-lived storms like Arthur, Bertha, and Cristobal generate very low levels of ACE. And you can see how low it is compared with an average season. An average season has 14 storms, 7 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. Now, you might be kind of wondering, how do you come up with these seasonal forecasts? Well, at Colorado State University, we've been doing seasonal hurricane forecasting since 1984. So this is our 43rd year of doing seasonal hurricane forecasts. And they were founded by my mentor at Colorado State, Dr. Bill Gray. He was a professor at CSU teaching hurricane science. And one of the years he was teaching hurricane science, he was kind of this fount of knowledge. He knew which years were busy hurricane seasons. He knew which years were El Nino seasons. And this is long before Wikipedia. He just had all this stuff memorized. He was more of an Encyclopedia Britannica kind of guy. But he knew which years were busy hurricane seasons in the Atlantic, and he knew which years had El Nino conditions in the Pacific. And he said, wait a minute, when we have El Nino in the Pacific, we tend to get fewer hurricanes in the Atlantic. And that kind of made him scratch his head. Like, why would something going on in the Pacific Ocean impact hurricanes in the Atlantic Ocean thousands of miles away? And so, just to reiterate, El Nino is warmer than normal water in the central and eastern tropical Pacific. It's a regularly occurring phenomenon, occurs about every 3 to 7 years. And when you get El Nino or you get La Nina, it makes big changes in how the tropical circulation changes, but also how the mid-latitude circulation changes. And El Nino and La Nina can also have significant impacts. We'll talk a little later about, what potential impacts we could see from this really powerful El Nino on Canadian weather this coming winter. But the reason why we care about it for hurricanes is because of what it does does to where thunderstorms form in the tropical Pacific. Typically, the waters are warmest in the tropical Pacific Ocean near Indonesia. In an El Nino, those extremely warm waters shift eastward. And so those strong thunderstorms shift eastward in response. And if we think about the circulation in a thunderstorm near the surface, the air goes into those thunderstorms, the air goes up in the thunderstorms, you get those big cumulonimbus clouds. High up in the atmosphere, those winds spread out. And so what this does in the Atlantic is it increases winds out of the west high up in the atmosphere. Near the ocean surface, the winds in the Atlantic tend to blow out of the east. These are what we call the trade winds. So if we think about this in a vertical cross section, we have what we call increased levels of vertical wind shear. The change in wind speed and direction with height in the atmosphere is very strong. And so when you get a lot of this vertical shear, like we get in an El Nino, the strong shear is good for us. It's bad for the hurricane. It tends to tilt the hurricane circulation, mixes in dry air, and really kind of squelches the building blocks of hurricanes, those really strong thunderstorms. So overall, too much shear, good for us, bad for the hurricane. La Nina tends to have lower levels of vertical wind shear. So next, what we're looking at are what we're currently seeing for water temperatures across the globe. If we look at the eastern and central tropical Pacific Ocean, we generally have very, very warm waters. We're not quite to record levels yet. We're running about third for strongest El Nino on record, with reliable records going back to around 1950. The Atlantic is actually running fairly warm right now. We have a region that we monitor called the Main Development Region, so named because that's a region where the strong hurricanes tend to develop in the Atlantic. That region is also somewhat warm, but because the tropical Pacific is so warm, we think the tropical Pacific is really going to dominate the circulation, and we're going to see very high levels of vertical wind shear for the rest of the hurricane season. If we look at vertical wind shear over, say, the last 30 days in the Western Atlantic, it's the highest on record, even ahead of 2015, which was another really powerful El Nino event. So overall, we do think that conditions are going to lead to a well below normal hurricane season, primarily due to these very strong increases in levels of vertical wind shear. The forecasts from the various models are very aggressive at calling for El Nino. As I mentioned before, the latest forecast from NOAA that just came out this morning is very aggressive for a very powerful El Nino. So it kind of remains to be seen if we're going to be the strongest on record, but certainly one of the strongest on record. And when you get these powerful events, it really tends to knock down your storms. In addition to knocking down hurricane activity across the basin, it also does tend to reduce your odds for landfalling storms, whether those landfalls be in the Caribbean, Central America, the United States, or up into Canada. The tropical Atlantic and North Atlantic, as I mentioned before, are still somewhat warmer than normal. If we didn't have the El Nino, given how warm the Atlantic is, we'd probably be talking a pretty busy season. But because the El Nino is so powerful, we do think that the Atlantic Ocean is going to play kind of a secondary role to what goes on in the Pacific Ocean this year. But that being said, if the shear, happens to lower in a small part of the basin, given how warm the waters are, we could still see storms, potentially developing. Another thing I do want to point out is that the shear signal from El Nino tends to be strongest in the deep tropics. As you move towards higher latitudes, say towards the Gulf of Mexico or a little or east of the Bahamas, the shear relationship with El Nino is somewhat weaker. Those storms tend to be weaker just because they tend to have a shorter lifetime, but we still need to pay attention. And obviously, just because the odds are down doesn't mean the odds are zero. So certainly we need to be paying attention to see, if anything does kind of sneak up on us. Storms, like we've seen so far, like Arthur and Bertha forming in the Gulf, kind of classic El Nino storms, not particularly, kind of sheared weak storms, but in the case of Arthur, did bring pretty significant flooding to parts of the northern Gulf Coast. As I mentioned before, vertical wind shear has been extremely high, highest levels of vertical wind shear that we've observed in the Western Atlantic for the recent past 30 days. So again, really El Nino is certainly exhibiting itself very powerfully already, and likely its impacts are going to continue to grow for the Atlantic hurricane season over the next few weeks. So we are expecting a fairly quiet hurricane season. If you're wondering why and saying, hey, the Atlantic's been pretty busy lately, you're right, it has been. We have not had a below normal Atlantic hurricane season as classified by NOAA since 2015. So it's been a long time since we've had a quiet season, but we do think the way things are going right now, the odds of a below normal season are quite likely this year.
Wow, yeah, that's amazing. And when we're looking at predictions and forecasts like that, how confident can businesses be in those seasonal forecasts, Phil, or what should they be, watching for?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as we go from our first forecast comes out in early April. And so that forecast, if you look at the skill of the models, is somewhat low. I mean, it's got some skill, but it's not great. And that's just because you're a long way from when the hurricane season really ramps up. So we put out our first forecast in April. The hurricane season officially starts June 1st, but again, doesn't really ramp up until you get into August. And there's a lot of stuff that can change with El Nino during the spring months. For example, in early April of this year, we thought it was pretty likely that El Nino was going to come, but certainly we didn't have the confidence that we were going to get, one of the strongest El Ninos on record in early April. By June, we reduced our forecast a bit from a little below normal to well below normal because our confidence in a robust El Nino was growing. And then by early July, we're like, okay, this is definitely coming on. So our confidence continued to grow. So this year, for example, our August forecast, we generally have fairly high confidence. This year, even higher confidence because the El Nino signal is so strong. And there's pretty much universal agreement from all the different models. This is going to be one, heck of an El Nino event. So we really do think it's going to drive well below normal hurricane season. Again, not to say we can't see significant impacts from storms, but certainly the odds do favor reduced landfall activity this year in the Atlantic. Now, with that being said, just because we have reduced activity in the Atlantic doesn't mean the same for our friends that care more about what's going on in the Pacific Ocean. Typically in El Nino years, the Pacific Ocean tends to have more hurricanes as well as more typhoons. And so there is a potential we could even be seeing a landfalling hurricane potentially heading towards Hawaii here in a few days. We just had a new tropical storm named Lala, kind of a fun name for a storm, that just formed a few hours ago. In this storm, they actually do have hurricane watches posted for the Big Island of Hawaii. Getting storms tracking towards Hawaii is kind of a classic El Nino signal. So it's not that storm activity around the world goes down in El Nino. If anything, it tends to go up a bit in El Nino, but certainly for the Atlantic, the hurricane seasonal threat does go down.
Yeah, thank you. And Blair, from your perspective, what are kind of the biggest ways that catastrophic weather events are changing Canada's collision repair industry?
Thanks, Mackenzie, and thanks, Dr. Phil. Blair Earl. I'm the Managing Director of Impact Canada, IAA, which we're an RV global company with strong Canadian roots. Phil, as we go back to 1984, the same as Bill when he started tracking the hurricanes. So a couple of the biggest things now, it's a 12-month season when we start looking at cats, and that's to be prepared for them 12 months of the year with all the collision partners, our insurance partners. One of the things that happened in the past that we'd see individual events if we went back 10 or 15 years ago. But I guess the headline coming out of Canadian Underwriter magazine by the editor in July, the fear of natural catastrophes always lurks underneath. And what they're referring to is in 2025, actually, there was a season where we didn't have as many, and I think Phil would concur in Canada. It was $2.4 billion worth of damage and cost to the insurance industry. In 2023, which is the big year, we went over $9 billion. Now, whoever would have thought that we'd think about $2.4 billion as being a good year with catastrophes? And that's just what it's led to. We just want to make sure we're prepared, our partners are prepared, and we do that on a regular basis as we get ready for the start of the season.
Yeah. And as you touched on before, every catastrophe creates this kind of surge in damaged vehicles. What determines whether those vehicles end up in a collision repair facility or at an IAA auction?
Well, there's a whole bunch of factors involved. It's not any one factor. You could talk about traditional factors like the vehicle age and value, the cost of repair. With the advent of ADAS, it's becoming a bigger topic with our insurance partners and with our collision repair partners. And then some of the latest things that have happened over the last year and a half is the availability of parts as they flow back both sides of the border. One of the great things is that, we've been green before green was popular in Canada with Impact, and we have parts available every day for repair. And then the vehicle tech repair process, as well as qualified techs to repair those vehicles, has become a major factor. So there's many different factors. There's not just one thing. It's actually quite a complicated equation. But once again, the economics for an insurance company and for the collision repair facility has to make sense.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of barriers there. Are you seeing more vehicles being declared total losses after catastrophic events? And if so, if I may double barrel my question, what's driving that shift? Is it vehicle complexity, like you mentioned, repair costs, parts availability, cycle times, or something else?
Well, I think we really got to break it down into the type of cat. If you look back to 2024 and the Calgary hailstorm, many of those vehicles maintained their vehicle and the value, and the decision to repair them was based on the value that they get in the marketplace and then how fast to repair in the Alberta marketplace. The salvage values since the pandemic have been through the roof, and we've maintained those in the auction lanes so that the insurance companies have never had a better time as returning their percentage in the market in the lane for the vehicle. So it's quite a complicated factor, but one of the things I think worth expanding on, we've heard ADAS as a topic now for many years. 92% of the vehicles produced today has some sort of ADAS system in them. And the availability of those parts to fix the ADAS system, depending what it is quite complicated and could take a prolonged period of time. In that instance, it might make more sense to get the higher value in the auction lane and write the vehicle off.
Yeah. IAA handles thousands of vehicles following catastrophe events. Based on what you're seeing, Blair, how can, collision repair businesses better prepare before the next major storm hits?
Well, there's a whole bunch of prep things that not just collision repair, but we all can do, long before the weather shows up, and we know it's coming each year as it becomes a topic in the industry. The operational piece and the CAT response plan is put together. We take a look at, as a result of 24, there were some great learnings there because we had the teams mobilized to move and service the Calgary hailstorm. And at the same time, the floods happened in Quebec. So we actually rerouted our people to be on the ground in Quebec because the hail evaluation was taking longer in Alberta. So it's basically planning for every instance and then having staff available both to travel, and with our Canadian centralized service system, which we built in Canada, we can service that business from coast to coast. 7/24, 365. So the team plays a big part in that. And then our communication with our marketing team and our insurance partners. When the event happens, we notify them right away where we've got our own yards set up, our yards with our Ritchie Brothers partners, and our partnership yards that we have, and that we could receive the cars. And we have timelines that fit for the insurance company and our towing partners. I'd say the biggest thing, and probably give a shout out, the level of expertise by our people. We've been doing this since 1984, and the complexity and the instances that this occurs. My own personal experience yesterday, I didn't look at the weather as I was driving back up Airport Road in Ontario, and I started getting warnings of tornado, hail, and wind. So we're not immune in any part of the country anymore. It's north, south, east, west.
Yeah, definitely. It's getting, less and less, well, I would say for me, less and less predictable. But Dr. Phil, you might have a different opinion there.
I would say the moral of the story is always be checking the weather.
Yeah. Many shop owners, kind of view, Blair, like you said, what happened recently in Ontario, these kind of flash storms and things like that, but catastrophic weather events as an opportunity because they generate some work. From your perspective, do you think that's still true, or are today's catastrophes reducing repair opportunities as more vehicles are being declared as total losses?
I think it really depends on vehicle by vehicle and the complexity in that vehicle. But I've got to give a shout out to, our collision repair partners and what they've done by investing in equipment and also in training for their people. And I think throughout the industry, it's been a focus over the past 15 years to increase that training as we get more CATs. But it really depends on the type of vehicle. And as I said earlier, having 92% of the vehicles produced today with more technology than ever before adds a certain level of complexity.
Mm-hmm. And does that kind of change how shops should think about growth? As you said, those highlighting points and investing in that training?
Yeah, I would say the big 4 or 5 points is continuous training of your people and certifications, and even more training on EVs and ADAS systems. Build operational flexibility with multiple shifts with staffs, and then prepare for those different types of CATs. Because like I said, we've currently in the country over the past 3 months, we've had fire, flood, wind, tornado, and God knows what's next. I mean, Phil and I had a catch up earlier in the week, and we talked about, Hurricane Debbie. And that seems so far back in our history, but it basically swept houses off the shorelines of Newfoundland. And at the same time, we were having fires across the country. So those are the big things to get prepped for the body shop. One thing, the constant communication. A third point is with the insurance companies. So we can plan capacity as partners throughout the industry and investment in technology to be able to repair those complicated vehicles today. And then do some training beforehand. We model what's going to happen now. And I think that's really helped us as a company, and it's really helped the industry.
Yeah. And we've talked about how the ADAS and different technology elements are kind of shaking things up a bit. How are EVs changing the salvage and repair equation after floods, hailstorms, fires, all those things?
We've been dealing with some sort of FAB or EV going all the way back to the introduction of the Priuses in Canada.
Yeah.
So I think the increase in volume really has made everybody aware. We train 12 months of the year on the treatment of EVs and the growth in those at each of our branches. So at 16 branches across the country, we deal with them every day anyway. And we have a safety system in place to service those vehicles to make sure they're safe if they've been touched by water. We minimize fire risk and we place them strategically in a safety pattern within the branch.
And are there any early warning signs that a vehicle is probably headed towards total loss before a shop invests significant time in estimating or disassembly?
I think the learnings from the fires that we had, especially if we go back to Fort McMurray, I think, there's a different cat velocity when it's hail, when it's a flood, and when there's fire. And there's a difference in the type of vehicle you're going to get. And more of the vehicles in a fire and more of the vehicles in a flood are going to be written off than in hail. But I mean, the repair threshold and the value for the used vehicle in Canada today, because we're still at a supply disadvantage with used vehicles across the country, you're seeing more and more of those wrote off. But each individual vehicle has to receive a condition report before the decision is made. And I would leave more detail on that on a future podcast up to our collision partners.
Sounds amazing. And opening it up to you, Phil, and Blair as well. What's the one thing that you hope collision repair professionals can take away from today in understanding catastrophic weather events and how they impact the industry?
I mean, I think, and certainly in terms of the forecasting ability, that is certainly improved. I spend most of my time with hurricanes. The ability to forecast hurricanes has really, really improved. In addition to just a lot of kind of the traditional weather models, we're using a lot with these artificial intelligence-based models have really, really helped with getting better forecasts of both hurricane track as well as intensity. A lot of these tools are also being applied to forecasting, severe convective storms, so things like hail and tornadoes, as well as even wildfires. You're getting better predictions of wildfire weather. So I think really the ability to forecast these things has improved. Of course, a lot of the challenges, especially hurricanes are one thing, but when you start to get into whether a tornado is going to form or exactly where a wildfire is going to ignite, that becomes a real challenge, obviously, especially with wildfire. Obviously less in Canada than the US. The US, a lot of them are human caused. Obviously, Canada, some are human caused, a lot more are lightning caused. And so trying to kind of pinpoint exactly where things are going to happen. But certainly from a longer term perspective, the forecasts have gotten better. And I think really one of the things that we really do have for this year is, we have a strong El Nino, very powerful El Nino, and that is kind of what we call like a forecast of opportunity, in that when you get such a strong forcing, that does really help improve our predictability for the upcoming winter. For example, we know the jet stream tends to split a bit more in El Nino, so you tend to be warmer and drier in places like the Prairie provinces, even up into Western Canada. So potentially, fortunately, maybe exacerbating the wildfire threat for 2027. It gets a little murkier when we get into severe convective storm, just because El Nino tends to exit fairly quickly. But I think from my perspective, especially focusing a lot on hurricanes, when you get a powerful El Nino, we know next year, by the time we get to next year's hurricane season, the odds of El Nino are extremely low. And so we do anticipate, for example, next year, probably a much more active hurricane season, since we won't have El Nino putting the brakes on. So I think while these events are unfortunately becoming more frequent, and obviously a lot of challenges with response and even the tools that we have to forecast have gotten better and will likely continue to improve. So hopefully, be able to stay ahead of these things as they continue to promulgate.
Amazing. And Blair, yourself?
Yeah, I would just have to, drive home the point that this all works because of great communication. And we do that with our partners, both on the insurance and collision side, but also, our transportation partners and our towers. And you have to have someone who wants this product after the cat, and the buyers of this product. There is a demand for it. A lot of the times a hail car can bring great money for the insurance company. And we spend our time marketing those vehicles to those buyers that are interested in them. But I really think the partnership, the communication, and then once again, our system coast to coast. We can service 724, 365 when these things happen, and we're prepared for them. In our 16 IAA locations and our 15 Ritchie Brothers locations, we have land to be able to service that business. So I would like to see less cat events, but my friend Dr. Phil here has educated me over the past couple of years that is very unlikely to happen. The trend looks like they're going to continue, and just wishing all Canadians out there and our good friends south of the border less wind and more rain to get the fires under control. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Blair, and thank you, Phil, for joining me today on this episode of Industry Insider. There are some graphics for those of you who are listening audio only that if you head to our website, the link should be in the description of wherever you are listening, you can check out because Dr. Phil showed us some wonderful, wonderful graphics right at the top there. From all of us at Collision Repair Magazine, we thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.